Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Mary Gallagher. I'm the Dean of the Keough School of Global Affairs. Welcome to, I believe, our last Dean's Forum on Global Affairs this semester. Today's conversation comes at a critical moment when questions of democracy, identity, and solidarity are not distant concerns, but urgent realities shaping Europe and the wider world, including the United States. We're grateful today to partner with the Keough-Naughton Institute for Irish Studies and the Nanovic Institute for European Studies to bring this important discussion to our community. And it's my privilege to introduce our two speakers. Professor Brigid Laffan is Emeritus Professor at the European University Institute in Florence, Chancellor of the University of Limerick, and President of the European Policy Centre in Brussels. She served as Director of the Robert Schuman Centre for Advanced Studies at the EUI until her retirement in 2021. She's a leading scholar of European integration. She's authored and edited numerous books and articles, including her 2023 book, The EU's Response to Brexit, United and Effective. Additionally, Professor Laffan has received international recognition, including the Lifetime Achievement Award from the United States European Studies Association. Professor Rory Finnin is professor at the University of Cambridge and founder of the Cambridge Ukrainian Studies Program. His research focuses on culture and identity in Ukraine, with particular attention to Crimea and Crimean Tatar literature and broader questions of nationalism, solidarity, and cultural memory in the Black Sea region. He's the author of Blood of Others, Stalin's Crimean Atrocity, and The Poetics of Solidarity, which has received multiple international awards, including the award from Notre Dame, the 2024 Lawrence Shannon Prize. Professor Finnin is also a returned Peace Corps volunteer in Ukraine and a visiting professor through the Nanovic Institute for European Studies this year at Notre Dame. Today, they will bring us insights that speak directly to the complexity of Europe's current moment. Please join me in welcoming them. Thank you.
Doing what we're told with microphones. Well, Mary, thank you so much for the introduction. I want to relay my thanks to the Keough-Naughton Institute, the Nanovic Institute for arranging and organizing this event. And Brigid, it's such a pleasure and a privilege for me to be up here from you. I was just saying to Colin how I've been reading your work and learning so much. So it's a great pleasure. Nice to see all of you. I know the sun is not quite shining. This is billed as a fireside chat. There isn't a fire, but there was a warm sun earlier today, but you're still here. Thanks for that. Brigid, what a difference a weekend makes.
Yes, indeed.
Because last Thursday, I noticed an announcement of this session. I looked again at the title of it and seized on this word rupture with no small measure of concern and anxiety. But on Sunday, in fact, Easter for Eastern Rite Christians, the people of Hungary chose more suture in Europe rather than rupture. They voted out the government of Viktor Orban, which had been in power for 16 years. And I think my favorite description of Orban is from the political scientist Ivan Krastev. And he describes Orban as a right-wing Castro. Yes. That is a man who's in charge of a small country that becomes the center of ideological lodestar, ideological touchstone for a global movement after being propped up by Russia. So he's someone who is self-described illiberal politician, but the turnout was huge in Hungary, over 77%, the largest turnout since the end of communism in Hungary in 1989. Orban's party lost decisively. Peter Magyar's TISA party won 133 out of 198 seats in the parliament, so a massive supermajority. He framed that electoral victory as a kind of liberation for Hungary. Orban, meanwhile, called it painful and conceded on election night. Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the EU Commission, spoke very poignantly in terms of solidarity by saying that Hungary chose Europe, but Europe always chose Hungary. So I want to focus on this electoral result because I think it has a lot to teach us about almost every single thing we'll probably talk about today. And I want to be clear that when we're talking about Europe, we're going to center on the European Union, but naturally all of Europe's crises cannot be contained in its institutional and political borders. And I want us to always be aware of how Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine is targeting the European project itself and, of course, reshaping what the EU is for. You've written a lot about the EU politics trap. That is the way in which political polarization within EU member countries put constraints on national leaders to engage in collective action at the EU level. Orban's bread and butter was exploiting that trap and making it worse. So he turned a member state into one that was preventing and interfering with collective action. But just as with Poland in 2023, this illiberal government, let's say tyrant curious in many ways, was voted out by a massive democratic response. We might say that democratic backsliding was rejected by democratic front striding. That is, democratic activity, voters' voices were felt and expressed at the polls. I know this is one election. It's a historical result, but it's just one event. There are a lot of structural issues and problems that brought Orban to power. One might even say that the EU partially enabled him by affording him with so many EU funds that helped him demolish, one might say, Hungarian democracy. But nonetheless, I think it's a really important moment. So do you see a pattern evolving here in which illiberal governments finally run out of road once their voters begin to experience this economic, political, social pain in profound ways?
So in political science, we have a concept of earthquake elections. And those are elections that are not just routine, but their consequences live well beyond them. And this was an earthquake election. An earthquake election for Hungary and an earthquake election for Europe. Why? Because from 2010, when the energies of the EU were being absorbed by the Eurozone crisis, which was a major threat, the euro could have fallen. And if, as Chancellor Merkel at the time said, if the euro goes, Europe goes. It was that important. While that was happening and all of the energies of the governments in the EU were absorbed by trying to keep the single currency on the train tracks, Orban silently began to capture the Hungarian state. And then with a 2/3 constitutional majority, he began to reframe the Hungarian state. And he captured the state, reframed the state, and in my view also captured the society. But this was a massive societal rejection of what he had delivered and what he stood for. And it was a landslide. I think Orban would have won about 135 seats in the 2022 election, down to 55. This was a massive, massive defeat. And one of the interesting things is that when authoritarians rig electoral processes, rig constituencies, sometimes that rigging turns against them if there's a tipping of the electorate. And this was a tipping of the electorate. So it was he failed to continue to capture the society. And now Peter Magyar, who's taken over, has a 2/3 majority to reclaim the judiciary, to unravel the rigging of the state, and to unravel the Orban control of public broadcasting. So he won by enough, because one of the problems for Donald Tusk in Poland is slightly different in that he has a president who can refuse to finally enact laws.
Right.
And so there are barriers. But what Peter Magyar is saying is that even the president now has to go because he doesn't have the legitimacy. I think there's one other very important lesson that we haven't thought enough about yet because it's very immediate. And that is authoritarianism in a system that is scaffolded by both NATO membership and EU membership has limits. That authoritarians, they try to use elections to either to destroy the opposition, prevent the opposition, have choiceless elections. But it's very difficult to do that if you're an EU member state. You simply can't do it. So it's a very important lesson that, and I think other authoritarians in Europe will learn this, that they can capture for so long, but it's more likely to be episodic, is more likely to end in electoral defeat rather than coercive regime change. And I think that's really important, and we need to think much more about it. That just what does it mean that if you want to be part of international institutions that rely on law and cooperation as the EU does, you can't suppress alternatives forever. And I think that's a very hopeful thing. Then what it means for the other, I would have thought that Fico in Slovenia, Slovakia, is he understands he's now in an uncomfortable place. I think Nigel Farage can be beaten in the next British election, and Reform Party support is declining. Interestingly, in the latest elections in France, the local elections, the Rassemblement National did not manage to capture the cities that they thought they would. And of course, the other then is the AfD in Germany. So this is a major setback for the authoritarians in Europe. And that is a very good thing. I would not in any way be complacent, but this was good for Hungary, good for the EU, good for Ukraine in really important ways. And I have to say, even though, and we shouldn't again be complacent in the following sense, that Orban, he's not leaving politics. He has lived to fight another day, but that's fine. It is democracy to live to fight another day. But he will never, ever again, in my view, capture the state in the way he did. And we should also remember that the Orban playbook influenced authoritarians in other countries. So it was a massive rejection. And one has to ask also, why did the society turn? It turned because in the end, he didn't deliver economically, and he delivered a very corrupt state and society, really corrupt. His accolades, his father had a Versailles-like property that was filmed overhead. So I think we've had a lot of political turbulence in the world, but this was a good weekend.
It was a good weekend. I think, many of us were concerned that Orban might resort to violent repression. And I think your observation here about the often hidden power of EU institutions, obviously the embeddedness of Hungary's military in NATO really played a role. And the other thing I think we need to focus on is the activity of Peter Magyar and the TISA party itself, going from town to town, village to village, meeting with voters, because of course Orban had, as you said, complete control of media in the country. And to break through these state narratives, introduce a new idea to focus on corruption and the problem of corruption, as you say, but also with this sense of a sentiment of patriotism, I think is an interesting recipe for pulling countries and people's publics out of authoritarian regime.
And I would also add that they won by so much, it could not be a disputed election.
Oui.
There were threats of false flags. The Russians were there in large numbers. Russian bots were extraordinarily active. And it didn't matter, because Magyar went right down into the society. For 2 years he's been doing this. For 2 years he's been slowly going to villages, to towns, and Budapest was never pro-Orban. So he needed to recapture the country, and he really made inroads. And it's an extraordinary story of democratic electoral mobilization.
Couldn't agree more. And we're going to make sure that we have an exchange with all of you in a little while. We have a few things that we want to address. I want to talk a bit about something that hits close to home for me. I think we are seeing in Europe a grave crisis, a grave threat to European security. As someone who studies Ukraine and listens and has to listen to Russian political, public, cultural discourses that are largely framed around questions of grievance and aggression, I've been saying for quite a long time, essentially since the invasion of Georgia, just how frequently in Russian information space the word war is used in reference to Europe and, of course, the United States as well. So Russians have been talking about war with the rest of the world. We haven't been paying attention. Certainly, we've not been wishing war against Russia, but nonetheless, we have to be aware of their speech and their posture. And so I've been trying to sound this warning. It's pretty straightforward to anybody who's been paying attention to the intersection between Russian words and Russian deeds of the past 20 years or so. And that is that Europe is under attack by an aggressive state that happens to be the largest in the world. These are hybrid attacks, certainly, but they're attacks against public infrastructure. Sometimes they're targeted assassination of corporate executives, political leaders. There's sabotage of industries. We need to be thinking of these kinds of actions as part of a broader spectrum of what we often associate as kinetic conventional warfare. But we don't do that in Europe. This kind of talk of war and a war footing that is cognitive, that is mental, is, I still think, far away for a lot of European publics, even though when you look at a lot of EU polls, there is a turn towards questions of security among EU citizens. They understand that the EU has a role to play in their collective defense. But nonetheless, we are confronting this problem all the time of Russian hybrid attacks that aren't taken seriously. I remember just a couple of years ago being at RAF's Mildenhall Air Base with drones loitering overhead. They couldn't be jammed. No one knew the origins. They weren't being shot down because the service personnel on the base didn't want to discharge a weapon with a bullet has to go somewhere, and they weren't given orders. So these would just loiter above us. Not really reported in the press, but among military officials and soldiers, something of great concern. So I want us to return to this question of rupture for a moment, Brigid, because for me, the rupture isn't necessarily political, social, or economic. It's in many respects epistemic. It's a way of thinking about the threats before us, confronting them, calling them by their names. Just this week, the Labour Party official, Lord George Robertson, former NATO Secretary General, former UK Minister of Foreign Affairs, said this, and I wrote this down, quote, "We are underprepared, we are under attack, we are not safe. Britain's national security and safety is in peril." That's a really remarkable thing from such a long-standing British official who's also responsible for writing the security assessment of British Armed Forces just last year. So this is a really severe issue. There is a kind of weaponization of confusion. How is Brussels addressing this, in your view? Robertson called it corrosive complacency. Does Brussels feel the same in your experience?
No, not any longer. I would have thought that after the collapse of communism in 1989, Europe, in a sense, bought off the peace dividend. It spent less on defence and security and much more on other things, and thought that war in Europe was impossible and highly unlikely. And then we had the Crimea, 2008 onwards. But it really, in my view, took the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, which was far too late for Europe to wake up. But the full-scale war in Ukraine was an extraordinary shock, a palpable shock to Europe, to European societies. I would also distinguish between those who are on the front line and the others. The group of states called the Baltic Nordic 8, they have no illusions. The Poles have no illusions. If you're Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, you've no illusions. If you're Finland, you've no illusion. So I think the further east on the continent, they understand, they experience and understand. But I do think all of Europe has now woken up to the threat. It's felt less keenly in the south, Spain, Italy, Greece. It would be the Middle East, Turkey.
Sure.
So I think that that Europe has woken up, and then the second shock, of course, was and there is no excuse because there was Trump 1, was Trump 2.
Yeah.
And so now all European capitals and Brussels are working really, on a daily basis to build defense and security capability again in Europe. They're doing it through NATO. The concern is, will NATO survive? If NATO doesn't survive, then there will be a European NATO. There's no doubt. Mm-hmm. And all of this is being put in place. And I think, the Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, says Europe needs to be ready for 2030. That's about what the Commission is thinking. For the first time ever, there's a Commissioner for Defence, unheard of. The Defence Committee and the European Defence Agency is now headed by a military person, which was not the case in the past. The question is, how much time does Europe have to build the capabilities that it needs? But it also has an extraordinary asset, and the asset is Ukraine. Because Ukraine has proven to have a level of technological innovation in drone technology and robotics that could simply not have been anticipated at the beginning of the war. And all of the militaries in the western half of the continent are desperately trying to catch up with this level of innovation and level of knowledge. And also, Ukraine will become an EU member state and will be a battle-hardened country with a very strong military, and will have to continue, I suspect, to have a very strong military, regardless of what happens in terms of Russia-Ukraine relations. So Europe will not remain defenseless. It's not simply going to, and we also have to think about the relative resources of the combined member states of the EU and Russia. Europe has assets, it has resources, it can do it. The question is, and it is doing it. Major expansion, a big change in German rearmament. And for years, everyone was saying Germany had to rearm. Well, now it is. France never lost its military. It reduced its expenditure, but France has a military capacity that's there. I would have thought the UK has probably eroded its military capacity more than France. But there is, and Europe will always be messy, and it's never going to have quite the authority and quite the effectiveness that it would have if it were a single country with a government. But that's not an available future. So if you ask me, will Europe in the next 5 to 10 years develop that capability? It's doing it.
I agree. I suppose you raised a really important example of Ukraine, and we'll talk, of course, more about it, and we should be talking much more about it, particularly in this country. But I'm thinking about the way in which civil society in Ukraine jumpstarts so much activity in the Ukrainian state. It's really Ukrainian civil society that's driven so much innovation. I'm interested in whether you feel as though our colleagues in Brussels are reaching out to the civil societies at different member states and understanding that when it comes to confronting this threat, it's all hands on deck, civil society in tandem with the state, building this capacity that's spiritual, cognitive, as well as military and political.
So I think when it comes to building the capability, the resilience must start from the ground up, which is in the member states. Remember that the EU doesn't have this massive bureaucracy that it can. The Commission is a relatively small institution by administrative standards. So that it really has to come from the society. And so if you were to ask me, which country in Europe has done most on the resilience? Probably the Finns. They do it because they have this extraordinarily long border with Russia, and they obviously have the historical memory of losing a lot of territory to Russia. They take nothing for granted. They take nothing. And I would have thought the Balts, the Nordics more generally, the Poles are building that resilience. Germany will, France will. Probably much less in my country, where we think because we're small and we're out there in the Atlantic that we're safe. We're not. About 75% of all of the communications cables coming to Europe come into Irish waters, and we have four. The Irish Navy has only 4 vessels that can put to sea. So if there is a country that has its head in the sand, I'm afraid it's mine.
I'm glad that you raised this because, of course, I want to talk about Irish neutrality. I
actually care for my blood pressure.
Is it tenable? Is it fit for purpose, given the threats that...
Absolutely not. It's a disgrace. It's a disgrace. But because it's very interesting, and it goes back to your epistemological cognitive. So Brand Ireland was, we do peacekeeping and humanitarian aid and development cooperation. We're good. And a values-led foreign policy, which I approve of. But I always worry when a value-led foreign policy does not shields you from your interests. Yeah. And because we were geographically, the great irony of the island of Ireland is, for much of our history, we happen to find ourselves beside a dominant power, the global imperial power. And then suddenly, from the foundation of the state, that was no longer the case. Yeah. So we were safe. We could be neutral in the Second World War, not because we could defend ourselves, but because it would have cost anyone too much to invade us. So that has perpetrated a mindset that doesn't take defense and security seriously. And we have a president now who won an election campaign on the basis of we're nice and we're good. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, the Russian naval spy vessels are in our waters. They're plotting the cables.
3 and 1.
Overhead, we don't know what's in the air. The RAF scrambles to protect Irish airspace. So Ireland has a big wake-up call coming. We had a very serious cyber attack on our health system, but that didn't seem to be enough to animate the society.
We need more Irish fishermen.
And so, because I argue in the public realm that Ireland needs to take defence and security seriously, I am labelled a warmonger. Mm-hmm. So that is where the society is. But it's going to there will be a hell of a shock. Either an attack to an electricity interconnector or a cable, or multiple cables. But it's an awful pity that it will take a serious event to get a country to take agency. And there's a lot, even in Ireland, there's a lot happening. I mean, they're mapping the seabeds now. We are going to have more naval vessels. We're developing more capability, but from such a low base, we spend 0.24% of our gross product on defence.
Yeah.
There are fewer than 8,000 individuals in the Irish Armed Forces combined. So we're effectively defenceless.
Yeah.
And that's not something, and it's not about neutrality. Ireland would not meet the minimum standards to join NATO. We wouldn't be allowed in. So we've got to stop having a discussion about joining military alliances, which we're unprepared for, and we're simply not, we don't have much to offer. And focus on how do we cooperate with our neighbours to ensure that the collective interest in the Atlantic seaboards are met. So we get there, but we're starting from a shocking place.
Well, you're starting from a shocking place, and at the same time, in the summer, the EU Council presidency will be assumed by Ireland. So when you consider the threats of the East, how do you foresee Ireland's role in that presidency, and how do you think they'll set the agenda?
So I guarantee you the word security will be in the priorities of the presidency. So remember, the presidency doesn't give you a lot of agenda setting powers. You simply chair the Council of Ministers, all the working parties. And your job is to take the work that the previous presidency has done in Cyprus, and you then push the negotiations on. That's the responsibility of a good presidency. But Ireland will host both an informal European Council, all the heads of government, and the European political community. So for the first time ever, there will be 40 to 47 heads of state and government on the island of Ireland. And that has to be secured. And I imagine we will ask our neighbours, both the British, the French, probably the Spaniards or Portuguese, to send some capability. And they will. And it's being negotiated already.
How's the blood pressure?
Once I get it off my chest on neutrality, I'm fine.
I'm going to raise it even more now, because you talked about your country. Let's talk about this one for a moment. From the perspective of the EU, they've got this very clear, very harrowing threat to the east, and now they've got this unexpected, amorphous, constantly shifting threat to the west from Washington. So, normally our media grabs these various social posts and comments from the White House, etc. I want to approach this by citing from the U.S. National Security Strategy, which was released in December 2025. It's a mandated public document that's put together by the executive, compiled by the National Security Council to articulate our strategic vision. So I'm citing from it here. The larger issues facing Europe include activities of the European Union that undermine political sovereignty and liberty, migration policies that are transforming the continent in creating strife, censorship of free speech, the suppression of political opposition, cratering birth rates, and loss of national identities and self-confidence. Should present trends continue, the continent will be unrecognizable in 20 years or less. Now, obviously, the last sentence is hyperbolic. What I'm interested in here is less, let's say, the rhetoric, but the narrative of the EU decline that bases and is underneath this comment. Kaja Kallas has said that, quote, Trump and his administration don't like the EU, quote unquote. I think this narrative of decline is something we should discuss, because it's premised on the idea that because the U.S. has a very stable share of global GDP, EU has lost its share in some ways. The American economy is estimated around 31 trillion. EU is about 22 trillion, and it's been slipping over the past decade. But our focus on nominal GDP, share of global GDP, to me, actually, it is somewhat misleading, because we're not taking into account income inequality, which is much higher in this country than it is in the EU. So I'm interested in this narrative of decline, and how do you think Brussels is approaching it? How do they want to contest it? How are they contesting it?
So both Brussels and every national capital in Europe understands that this US administration is no friend of Europe and no friend of the EU. And the transatlantic alliance, which was one of the most stable alliances with the most trust, probably in history, is fraying, and not fraying just at the edges. In my view, it's fraying right through. And that's an extraordinary change in relations in the North Atlantic, where if you look at the trade volumes, the interdependencies, it was win-win. Europeans were not spending enough on their own security, there's no doubt. And successive American presidents that said to the Europeans, you've got to spend more, were right. And finally, the Europeans are doing it. But then there is a visceral, and I would say it's visceral in this administration. It started with Vance at the Munich Security Conference last year, the dressing down of Zelensky, the summit in Alaska, and then Liberation Day, the tariffs. Europe all European capitals would want to maintain the transatlantic alliance, but they also now understand that they've got to have a very strong insurance policy because they don't any longer trust the commitment of the United States to Europe. The trust has been deeply eroded. And also then the language. So this was a national security strategy talking about countries that when it came to 9/11, most of these countries, when the US activated NATO Article 5, they sent their troops to Afghanistan to fight with the US. So then also the language of decline. So there is no doubt that technologically Europe is behind both China and the US. That is undoubtedly the case. And Europe has struggled since the global financial crisis to catch up. But the reality is, if you actually take out the top 1% of US income earners, Europe is just as rich as the US. And it has a much, much weaker or much stronger and more even distribution of income with much stronger welfare protection. And the idea that somehow or other Europeans there's a sense that Europe has become beautiful cities, historical artifacts, lovely museums, great place to eat, great place to visit. But those of us who live there actually want Europe to work. And there are pockets of real innovation all over Europe, including Ukraine, in as we said earlier. So the idea that Europe is going to go down the tubes with great style is simply not the case. There's no desire of anyone in Europe. Does Europe have real economic challenges? Yes. But interestingly, one of the great assets this country has is it has very deep and liquid capital markets. And so when it comes to startups, you can get venture capital in this country that you can scale up. In Europe, the Europeans, and I think it comes from history, the Europeans save, don't invest. And there's a huge investment gap in Europe, and Europe has got to unlock the savings that are in banks that aren't being used productively for the future. So I would not in any way want to give the impression that Europe does not face very serious both economic and societal issues. But the idea that somehow or other Europe is going to go down the tubes is far too it's far too comforting. It's not. It still has strong universities.
Okay.
Unfortunately, we export far too many of our good scientists to this country, although there is now a reverse. There is a reverse over the last 2 years, and I know because I see it in the job market. Mm-hmm. There are Europeans who were based in the US coming back to Europe by choice now. And then migration is a very challenging issue for Europe because geographically the gap in income between North Africa and Africa and the other side of the Mediterranean is so great that the push factors from Africa, but also from other poor parts, Africa, there's a lot of Afghanistan. There is also the weaponization of migration by Putin in Libya and in Belarus, the Belarusian border. So there are, and because of mobility, so all of the refugee protection treaties were signed at a time of non-hypermobility. But now we live in a world of hypermobility. And so there is a constant push factor. And an enormous number of people have lost their lives trying to cross the Mediterranean. And it is also an industry. The illegal transportation of people is now a very big industry. So again, and the issue there is burden distribution. because there are countries in Europe, including Hungary, that won't take any refugees. And then the southern European countries are overwhelmed. I lived in Italy for 8 years. I visibly saw it.
Really.
And so migration is a wedge issue, and it's a wedge issue in politics. Yeah.
We are about to open up the floor for your questions, particularly questions from students. But we started on a bright note, a positive note, thinking about the electoral results in Hungary. I want to end this part of the discussion with a bright note and talk about solidarity, because the one word that we might say is repeated so frequently in past 20 years, given the constraints of national sovereign governments.
So all political systems and polities require solidarity, but you will never in the EU get the level of solidarity that you get within a nation state. So it's going to be thinner and different. So what is the solidarity you see in Europe? The first pillar of the solidarity is significant fiscal transfers from core Europe to poorer Europe. So the countries of East Central Europe have got, every year, year in, year out, get a sizable transfer to their economies from richer Europe. Ireland got a lot of money from the EU to develop, and now in turn we're a net contributor to the budget, so we pay more in than we get out. So that solidarity to what was called in the treaties the backwardness of the less favoured regions, cohesion is there, and it's real, and it helps, but it's not interpersonal transfers, it's interregional transfers to catch up. But it's not a permanent transfer union. It doesn't mean if you're poorer that you're going to get it forever. And that's what, for example, countries like Germany worry about, that the EU would ever become a transfer union, because they think they would always, and probably would be, one of the constant that they would have to transfer. So that's one area. Secondly, when it comes to fires or weather or anything, there are automatic processes where there are transfers of equipment and people across Europe. In health, you can go to other countries and have the operations, and your country must pay for them. There is free mobility, which is a form of solidarity. So I, as an Irish person, can work, live anywhere in Europe, and no one can refuse me access, provided I'm working. During COVID, 90 billion in solidarity. So it's not like it is in a nation state, but it is much stronger than it was in pre-EU Europe.
Yeah.
And again, another example of solidarity. So when the United Kingdom decided to leave the EU, it created a tremendous problem on the island of Ireland, because the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland became an international border of the EU. But Ireland could not reinstate a border because it would have been torn down. The danger was that it could have led yet again to violence. So 26 countries stood behind Ireland. So if you're in Tallinn, wherever, what happens in Northern Ireland doesn't affect you from day one to day two. But not a single country broke ranks with Ireland during that entire time. And Theresa May, British Prime Minister, asked Donald Tusk, who then was President of the European Council, why are you supporting Ireland on this issue? We're the large country and Ireland is the small country. And his answer was, Ireland is a member state. And Ireland is a member state. And to be a member state it's a different form of statehood than being a nation state. It's another layer on top of statehood. So I think, and even you see in Europe, slowly, because of linguistic differences, you do see a European public discourse, a European public space opening up. Of course, it's fragmented. And Ireland, whenever there's a discussion of federalism, the United States is always the EU will never be like the United States of America, but perhaps if the United States of America was formed today, it wouldn't be like the United States of America. In other words, it happened at a time when you had small government, etc., etc. So I think the legacy of European integration, which was hard won, and the other, I should also say that the other important form of solidarity is rich Europe could have had a cosy common market. It could have stayed on its own. It didn't have to enlarge to countries like Ireland or Portugal or Poland, but it did. So the interesting dynamic in the enlargement of the EU is that it has been characterized mostly by the incorporation of weaker and poorer states. And all of those states have benefited from membership. And if you want the ideal comparison, because it's living, in 1990, the gross product of Ukraine and Poland would not have been dramatically different. They were broadly at the same level of development, not entirely, but broadly. Poland has had a miracle. It's one of the great successes of the Eastern enlargement. And Poland, a country that had historically always found itself between Germany and Russia, suddenly found itself with a protective shield of NATO and the EU, and it could flourish and fly. And we talked yesterday about the Western Balkans. Again, if that enlargement goes well, the Western Balkans will be more secure, more prosperous, and people will have a better standard of living. And the same goes for Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine. Mm-hmm. So I think we need to, that Euroscepticism is the easy, all political projects have skeptics, and I think that's right. But Euroscepticism's, the arguments against the EU are actually very poor arguments, usually. Mm-hmm. Because, yes, there's a pooling of sovereignty. Countries submit to being vulnerable to each other. But it's a change in the practice of sovereignty. Countries don't lose sovereignty. They change how they practice their sovereignty. And in so doing, they gain margins of autonomy and control. And I mean, I have to say there are some European directives that drive me mad. The latest one is that the top of a plastic bottle can't be separated. But it's there for a very good reason, because the tops of plastic bottles were polluting our seas and polluting the ground. So there is a logic in most of the regulation. But of course there is, as with all regulation, there can be overkill as well.
Well said. And I think your work has made abundantly clear as well that over the past decade, the EU has survived polycrisis after polycrisis, Brexit, as you mentioned too, this hinge crisis between these polycrises, and come out stronger, arguably. I mean, the stability of the EU is evident.
Yeah. So there was an article in the Financial Times yesterday that I couldn't read because my FT is on my iPad, which is in Dublin. But I saw the title, and the title was the EU's weird resilience. And that is true. This is a tougher, more resilient political system than we think. And it survives. It shouldn't work, but it does. And it survives by certain norms. And also, the one thing the EU never does is it never leaves the negotiation table. Doesn't matter. It'll outlast anyone around the table. They just don't leave. And the institutions of the EU have, they now, each country has an ambassador in Brussels, both ambassador and deputy, and they're the kind of hinge between the capitals and Brussels. They're the people who, they're the eyes and ears of the government, but they're also the ones that relay back to the capitals what's happening. To be in Coreper, which is the entity that these ambassadors meet in, was always really hard work. You were never sent as an ambassador to the EU if you enjoyed the cocktail circuit. They wanted workers who could negotiate, who could manage a file, etc., etc. But Coreper met once a week. That was the norm. Coreper meets every day now. And it has to meet every day because I think Europe has about 3 weeks of jet fuel left. So the crises are binding the system together because there is probably no alternative. And I think the other thing I would say about the EU now is that its motto is unity in diversity. But the better motto for the EU today is what Draghi said about the euro: whatever it takes. This is a system that, to the extent that it possibly can, will do whatever it takes to address the challenges that it faces, which are immense. But then there isn't a single political system in the world today that is without challenge.
Let's take some questions from the audience, and if you would, I think there may be a microphone or two. If you would, identify yourself, if possible, and why don't we take 3 questions at once? Is that okay?
Sure.
Perfect. We'll take them in a group. I see a question at the back over to the left here.
Can I also say that I attended a class this morning, a deep dive in diplomacy, and the students were brilliant.
Thank you.
Who is that?
So for the first question, I'm Andrew. I'm a master's student here in global affairs. And if we could return to Hungary for a moment, I'm really curious to know, how should we understand the role of Peter Magyar himself in this story of democratic resurgence in Hungary? Because it was not that long ago that he was a loyal member of Fidesz, and a personal political crisis helped lead him into the opposition. Do you think the same outcome could have happened if there was, could an opposition that was totally outside of the previous government have had the same success?
So,
We'll take two more. I saw many hands earlier, and now they're. Okay, thank you.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Andreas Stim. I have a couple questions. The first one is, why does the US and Russia have the same interest in Ukraine? Is it just because they want to destabilize Europe? Or is it just, for the US, a place where they can propagate autocracy into Europe? The second question I have is, if Europe builds up its defenses, would Germany have to become a nuclear power? Because, the lesson of Ukraine is, you give up your nuclear weapons, you get invaded. You want nuclear weapons, the US invades you in Iran. So if both states would have had nuclear weapons, things would have played out totally different.
Thank you. Third question. Father Jim, did you have your hand up as well? Directing traffic.
Thank you, Brigid. I had 2, now you're getting a bunch of questions, so if we all ask 2, but you can choose. One question is whether or not you think is the Trump administration's support for authoritarian regimes in Europe, like Orban, creating a backlash? I think there's some discussion now in the U.S. media whether or not the Vance going to Hungary at the last minute to support Orban was actually backfired. Because perhaps what's happening now is that the nationalism on the U.S. side, particularly around issues like Greenland, has actually created less support within the nationalist parties in the EU. And then, because you talked briefly about regulations and this idea about, and Roy, you mentioned EU growth not keeping up, being behind China and Europe, the United States. What do you think about the Draghi report? I think that was last year. Do you think that's an effective report to get Europe back on track?
So we've got Mary with the Draghi report as well as the handshake of death from we also have a question from Andrew about Magyar and his singular role. And then Andres was asking about the interests of the United States and Russia in Ukraine.
So I'll take them from the top. I think Peter Magyar was very important because he knew what he was opposing, and he knew it from the inside out. And also he understood he was dealing with a very conservative country. So although Social Democrats would have been the dominant political force in Hungary in the immediate period after communism, it is now a very conservative country. So I think it did matter that he understood what he was dealing with, number one, and he understood that he needed to get beneath the control of communications networks. He needed effectively to go on the street, village to village to village. And he also ended up, he took a lot, he used his time very well. And I think that what the Orban machine itself had become probably clunky and time, electorates get tired. So I would have thought he made a big difference. In terms of why the US and Europe, or US and Russia against Ukraine, I would have thought that's just this American administration. I mean, the Biden administration had a very different approach. I remain puzzled by Trump's engagement with Russia. I think it has to go beyond, probably go beyond business interests. But it's not in the US interest long term for Europe to disintegrate, to become chaotic. There's a lot of skin in the game for the US economically in Europe. So it's a puzzle. It's a puzzle and very unhelpful because Ukraine deserves better. And I think I'm rarely shocked now by what politicians say, but when Vance said his proudest moment since this administration took over was that they stopped supporting Ukraine, then I find that profoundly and deeply shocking.
He said it between lectures about the Pope.
Well, I just think that's ignorance. And then Germany and nuclear, that's a really great question. I suspect that German society would struggle a lot. I mean, they're going to struggle with rearmament anyway. And maybe what we're seeing is the development of a European nuclear umbrella that begins in France. So I think the nuclear question is on the table in Europe. And I don't think it's just Germany. I think Poland will certainly have to think about it because there are real lessons. I mean, if you've nuclear, you're not going to be invaded. On Mary, on the backlash, I do think Vance was the kiss of death. Because, I mean, we're not stupid, that side of the world. So when you have a vice president come and say that there is external electoral interference in Hungary, and you're vice president of the United States of America, well, doesn't work. And it doesn't work to the extent that both the National Front in France, the Rassemblement National, Farage is really suffering. the more photographs there are of Farage and Trump, the worse it gets. And so I do think that the administration is having an impact on the capacity of the radical right in Europe. It's a warning to Europeans. It's a warning. And on regulation, so the EU is very bad at warfare, but rather better at lawfare. And, the Brussels effect, the dominance of or at least the potential use of regulation. But the trouble is, unless you have some of the tech yourself, it doesn't work. And the Draghi report was a very fair assessment of the challenges Europe faces, the need for investment. He's now talking of what he calls pragmatic federalism, which means more centralization. In other words, Europe has to do more together. Europe is destined to disappoint. It'll never hit the high water mark. It'll always fall short of the ideal, but the question is how far can it get? And I would have thought the biggest. So one other thing Europe has really got to do is get out of fossil fuels, and it can't allow its energy security be determined by outside forces. It's just got to do the transition as quickly and as carefully and as effectively and as fairly as it can. But Draghi, and there is also a companion report, the Letter report, and it strikes me, in order to say anything serious about Europe, you have to be a former Italian Prime Minister. That's the case.
Let's take another grouping of questions. And by the way, Andrew's question about Hungary is very well placed. And the Nanovic Institute is hosting a flash panel about the Hungarian electoral result a week from now, on Thursday. So please do tune in for that and keep on top of that announcement. A few more questions, please. In the front, please. We'll start in the front and then move to the back over here on the left. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Brigid, for joining us here in South Bend. I was in the Glenties in Donegal, as I told you yesterday after your conversation with Mary, and the topic of Ireland's neutrality is what I wanted to ask about. So, as you know, in the Keough-Naughton Institute, one of our major research initiatives is the Ireland's Project, in which we invest in research to consider the future of the island, north and south, whether that's a future border poll or whether that's making the island work better across two jurisdictions and maintaining the status quo. So I wanted to ask you if you were to commission research on the question of how neutrality intersects with Ireland's future, whether it's a unified island or a status quo, what would be your sort of top 2 to 3 research priorities when it comes to neutrality and security?
So I'll be very blunt. I would not frame it as neutrality. Because the minute you frame it as neutrality, you're framing it as a sacred cow. Much better, what is the future of security and defence of the island of Ireland? Much more serious. The neutrality discourse in Ireland links back to that brand Ireland, we're good, we do peacekeeping, we don't, and neutrality is ill-defined. Effectively, what it means is Ireland is not a member of a military alliance. But that doesn't give Ireland a free pass on generating the structures and capabilities to defend and secure itself. And of course, there is the other issue that part of the island of Ireland is in NATO. So I would be careful how you frame it. And any serious discussion of defence and security, of course, would make reference to the fact that Ireland is a non-member of a military alliance. But the more you can focus on the core and less on the discourse. So, for example, at the moment, Sinn Féin has a little bus tour on Irish neutrality. We must defend Irish neutrality. Well, no one is looking for Ireland to join a military alliance. No one. We don't bring anything to the table. So, and then there's this legislation that I'm sure you're aware of, the so-called triple lock. And apparently, if we lose the triple lock, Irish neutrality is gone. So I would be very careful if you want serious work. And unless you do serious work, it's not a contribution to the issue. And I mean that in the strongest possible way, that this is a wedge issue in the society, and it really matters how the problem is framed, and then what are the consequences of that framing. Now, I wouldn't start with neutrality.
I mentioned that we should group questions, and then I didn't police them properly. So thank you for answering that. Let's add 2 more.
So thank you very much for all these thoughts. And my name is Alina. I'm Fulbright FLTA, teaching Ukrainian language this year here. So my question would be more academic. We know, I think majority of us, Central European University, which used to be in Hungary, but then it's relocated to Vienna, which was the answer to like Viktor Orban policy. And I think that was kind of solidarity, right? So how to remain these European values inside of EU. So one question is kind of hypothesis. What do you think about the future of a Central European University? Could it be like then transferred to Hungary again as like, well, we are in solidarity with you, now you're like, okay, more like democratic. Yeah, we are returning our democracy. And second, maybe you can name like some European institutions, especially academic institutions, which show this solidarity and where we can kind of see this gathering together and working towards our goals, like the goals of democracy.
Thank you, Alina. And there was a question towards the back here. Thank you for passing the microphone.
Yep. Thank you so much. I'm Danny. I'm a senior studying global affairs. I had a question about the recent Italian referendum. It was like a yes vote note on separating the careers of magistrates and prosecutors in Italy, but it was largely seen by analysts as like a rebuttal to the Meloni government. Pretty overwhelmingly voted no. So my question is, how does this affect Meloni's government going into an election in 2027? As Meloni's pretty interesting because obviously she's kind of a Euro realist in a sense. She's not Eurosceptic. She's been able to work with Europe and plans such as like the Mattei plan in North Africa, for example, but also kind of seen as a bridge with President Trump to Europe, to the US. And I just kind of get your thoughts on that.
Thank you. So we have Alina on the Central European University question of academic solidarity. Danny, is it? Yeah? Danny on the Meloni and the Italian referendum.
Yeah, so I again, how any country would want to lose a very fine university. It's a tragedy. It was a tragedy. I remember giving a talk there about a couple of months before they had to move. And I should say that the building in the Central European University was designed by 2 Irish women architects. It's a beautiful building. I hope it goes back. It should go back. But maybe, so it was a very exhausting process for all of the academics and for the institution to reconstitute themselves in Vienna, to go from one system, administrative and state system, to another. I wonder about the energy. I wonder, can they do it? But it would be a wonderful, for me it was the sign that Orban, there was no redemption, because if you, in the 21st century, if you lose a good university, if you sacrifice a good university, it tells me that you're not at all interested in the future of your country. So I would hope it goes back. I would hope it goes back. On the Italian referendum, there's an iron law, I think, of Italian politics that whenever a prime minister thinks they can change the Italian constitution, the people say no. It's very difficult. If you remember Renzi, he overstretched and he went for big bang constitutional change and lost. Hers was more modest, and she still lost. And there is a really serious problem with the administration of justice in Italy in terms of time. It just takes forever to get redress. So I'm sure there were good arguments to address it, but clearly there were sufficient number of people in the electorate worried, didn't trust it, to vote for it. Whether it completely undermines her for the next election, I'm not so sure. I think she's been really effective. But you don't know you don't know. I can't predict the next Italian election. Because you don't know what balance of forces will emerge. I don't even know what the opinion polls are saying at the moment.
Interesting to see how Meloni's oppositional competitors have been speaking up in support of her, given Trump's
That's right.
attacks.
Yeah, Schlein. She defended her beautifully in the assembly.
Yeah, truly. Let's take one more. I think we have time for one more grouping of questions. Okay, and I will police them to make sure they're a group. Yes, sir. Please don't forget to identify yourself if you would.
Thank you. My name is Mike Miller, and I have questions on the east and on the west. In the east, Ukraine. How would you like to see the war end? And how do you think it will end? And on the west, France and England should be among the leaders, I think, in establishing defense policy for Europe and NATO. Do they have the economic wherewithal to do it? Thank you.
Got all that, yeah? Second question, I think Mahan over here.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm Mahan. I'm on the faculty of the Keough School, part of the Ansari Institute. You know, my question is about international law and consistency of the European position with respect to international law. One of the things that I observed, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is there was, and as expressed and represented on this panel, strong condemnation of Russia vis-a-vis its violence against Ukraine and its aggression. And there were lots of comments about, constant, you shouldn't bomb hospitals, the massacre at Bucha, civilian casualties. But then when we witnessed a similar kind of assault, or far worse perhaps, against Gaza, we didn't hear the same consistent position coming from Europe, whether it's the States or the EU. Is that correct? And if so, what does that mean, that inconsistency, or what some might say hypocrisy? And if it's not correct, correct the record. Thank you.
Then the third question. Thank you, Mahan. Thank you. Third question. Okay. Oh, thank you.
Sorry, maybe the final one. If we can go back to the enlargement conversation selfishly, I think it's clear what the incentives there are for Western Balkans or Ukraine in terms of membership there. But from the perspective of the EU, Brigid, do you think enlargement will sort of amplify the sort of internal ruptures that we know exist there, or do you think they will stabilize those? And perhaps the second part of the question is, what role do you think Ireland will play there? A stabilizer, a disruptor, mediator, or something else?
Okay, well...
Got all of them. We have...
yes.
Michael's
so starting
with...
Yes. Yeah. On eastern Ukraine. I think Ukraine, but I stand corrected because I'm sitting beside a specialist. I think Ukraine would probably accept wouldn't recognize Russian control of the captured territories. But they're not going to give Russia land that Russia has not won. And there are important strategic reasons why they shouldn't in the remaining part of the Donbass. So either it ends as a frozen conflict, but Ukraine will need security guarantees. It will need internally to become almost a garrison state, to continue to have the deterrence capacity, to make sure the Russians don't come calling again. For me, Ukraine must survive as a sovereign entity, capable of agency in the international system, become a member of the EU. In my view, it should also become a member of NATO, but that's probably not possible. And then in the West, France and the UK are the leaders in a way, but they both have economic difficulty. But France has, I think France is, at least Macron, and we don't know who's going to win the next French election, presidential election. Macron has understood the challenge, I would say, from the get-go. All of his speeches about the need for European strategic autonomy, and that is simply that Europe has to have a stronger capability. I think the French and the British are working closely together. There are an awful lot of coalitions of the willing in Europe at the moment. But whether they have the economic heft is a very good question. On international law, you're absolutely right. There is an inconsistency, and I would also agree with you that it's hypocrisy. But there is an enormous amount of organised hypocrisy in international politics. Didn't start and end and won't end in Europe, but there is an inconsistency. What is the source of that inconsistency? It's very clear. Ukraine, there is, at the beginning at least, absolute unanimity among the member states. That was eroded by Orban. But Europe understands that Ukraine is existential for its own security and future, and they agree. What's the difference on Gaza? The difference on Gaza is that it is an issue that deeply splits the member states, and has done forever and ever and ever. The early, way back 1980, the declarations on the Middle East, it was always a struggle to get the member states, the then member states, far fewer member states, to agree. And at the moment, given the balance of forces, there is no, in order to use the cooperation agreement with Israel, to sanction Israel in any way, you need a qualified majority of the member states. So not unanimity, just qualified majority. It is not there. There is not. It would require one or two countries to shift. So there are, as you know, countries that are very pro-Palestinian, and there are others who are more concerned about the long-term future of Israel. All countries in Europe are concerned about the long-term future of Israel, but they marry that to the two-state solution. In fact, you probably would get all EU member states to commit to the two-state solution, but whether that would translate then into any sanctioning of Israel, it's not there at the moment. So legally, you don't have a qualified majority at the moment. And yes, it is hypocrisy, but I would also say that hypocrisy, organised hypocrisy in international politics, neither starts nor ends in Europe. And on enlargement, so the EU is always unprepared for enlargement, but it always survives enlargement. And the Eastern enlargement has been a great success. with all of the problems that it generated in terms of cohesion, in terms of backsliding and whatever, Europe is a better place for enlargement. And so my hope is that the two remaining parts of Europe, the Western Balkans and the Russian near abroad, that their futures are secured within the European Union, and the European Union then learns to live with that scale. But that does probably mean constitutional change, new treaty. It certainly will require much more qualified majority voting than we have now. It will require a more centralized heft than we have now. But can Europe adjust and adapt to 36 states? Yes, it did in the past. It's always afraid of enlargement. But then you have a new status quo when the member states come in. And then it's afraid of the next. Even the countries who've joined are afraid of what happens the next. So will it be easy? Will the adjustments be smooth? No. But wouldn't it be a better, safer Europe if this can happen in the next 5 to 8 years? And I would hope that you would have at least 1 or 2 Western Balkan states in the next 3 to 4. And what role will Ireland play? Ireland has always supported enlargement. Why? Because we were the first poor state, as a whole country was poor, that joined the EU, and we know what it means. And so it was very difficult for an Irish government to say, you bring down the shutters on other countries. And it never has. But of course, will it cost? Yes. But again, I go back to that weird resilience that this system seems to have. I should also say, you should never ever be complacent about the capacity of any political system to disintegrate. It can, and has done in history. So I'm not saying that the EU's resilience is so robust that bad things won't happen. But what I will say is that if the EU, or the structures that allows these countries to cooperate, to live in peace and relative prosperity together, if those structures go and this system collapses, Europe will be the poorer for it, but so too will be international politics and the world. Europe, those of us who, you can see in European streets and cities the cost of the past in Europe. It's ever present. So Europe cannot afford to go back there. And that's why the Russian threat is so serious, and that's why Ukraine cannot lose this war.
Brigid, this event was sponsored by Keough-Naughton Institute, Nanovic Institute, 2 institutes that care deeply about teaching students about the history, culture, languages, cultures, in the plural, of Europe. And when it comes to enlargement, I want to conclude with this question. How does the academic study of countries and cultures mitigate some of those challenges of enlargement that you said are natural and eventually are overcome? I'm thinking in particular about studying a country like Ukraine. Why should students here in the United States pay close attention to the history and culture of the largest country within the continent?
Because countries are not data sets. And one of the criticisms I have of my own discipline is we became very data-driven. And data captures a lot, but it doesn't capture deep culture and history. And I'm always very struck in Europe by the way there are individuals whom I call the boundary managers. They're the people who can cross these cultures. So they're multilingual, they understand what they're dealing with. They go, so for example, on regional policy, you could have a Dutch regional economist finds themselves in Greece or wherever, and they need to translate their academic knowledge to this society as they find it and the economy as they find it. So I think there's no substitute for that kind of deep knowledge.
On that note, I would like to conclude our conversation. I do want to say it is a privilege to be at a school like the Keough School of Global Affairs, where this notion of integral human development is a response to this view that we can study the world by way of data sets, and to dig deeper is, I think, part of the mission of this university in this school. Thanks to the Keough-Naughton Institute, Nanovic Institute for hosting us, and please would you join me in thanking Brigid, please.